Bill Beck opened a can of sea rations. That was the first thing he did when he got off the helicopter at Landing Zone X-ray. November 14th, 1965. Somewhere around 10:30 in the morning. The Huey set down. Beck jumped out, and while the other men in his squad were forming up and checking their positions, he sat in the grass and opened a can. He wasn't being casual about it. He was hungry, and he'd learned in his few months in country that you ate when you could, because you never knew when the next chance would come. A few minutes later, his platoon leader got a call on the radio to move toward a creek bed at the base of the Chu Pong Massif. That's when the shooting started. Beck described it later with a sentence that doesn't leave you. When we first landed, I saw half a dozen guys get killed right in front and beside me before I even saw the enemy. All I saw was guys dropping. Beck was a drafted soldier from Steelton, Pennsylvania. He'd been working as a professional artist when the Army took him. He was an assistant machine gunner in Weapons Squad, 3rd Platoon, Alpha Company, 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry Regiment, 1st Cavalry Division. Hal Moore, who commanded the battalion, later described his men plainly. It was a draftee army, he said. Very few regular voluntary enlistees. Most of the troopers who stepped off those helicopters at X-ray had been civilians a year or two earlier. They'd gone through basic training, advanced infantry training, and the new airmobile course at Fort Benning. They were physically fit and reasonably well prepared for conventional warfare. What they were not prepared for was the Ia Drang Valley. I want to stay close to that gap. The distance between what these men expected and what they walked into. Because it's the center of this story. Not the tactics, not the larger campaign. The experience of being young, trained but untested, and stepping onto ground that belonged to an enemy you'd never fought before and couldn't see. The Ia Drang Valley sits in the central highlands of South Vietnam, west of Pleiku, hard up against the Cambodian border. The terrain is a mix of elephant grass, some of it taller than a man, sharp enough to cut exposed skin, scattered trees, dry creek beds, and thick jungle running up the slopes of the Chu Pong Massif, a steep mountain that rises to over 2,000 feet. In November 1965, the valley was being used by 3 regiments of the People's Army of Vietnam, the 32nd, 33rd, and 66th, as a staging area. These were not local guerrillas. These were trained, disciplined regular soldiers who'd marched down from North Vietnam, some of them veterans of Dien Bien Phu, and they knew the terrain the way a man knows his own house. They'd been operating in the Ia Drang for weeks, and they'd already fought and won an engagement against a South Vietnamese outpost at Plei My before the Americans came looking for them. Moore's battalion, 450 men, was ordered to air assault into the valley on a search and destroy mission. 16 Hueys would carry them in, which meant the insertion had to happen in waves. Moore chose LZ X-ray, a clearing about the size of a football field, because it was the closest available landing zone to where intelligence said the enemy was concentrated. He knew he'd be landing 90 men at a time, and that each lift would take about 30 minutes for the round trip back to the staging area at Plei My. That meant the first group on the ground would be alone for half an hour. If the enemy was close, those 90 men would have to hold until the next lift arrived. The first lift went in around 10:25. Moore was on it. Alpha Company under Captain Tony Nadal and Bravo Company under Captain John Herron started fanning out to establish a perimeter. The clearing itself was dotted with termite mounds, hard, waist-high pillars of baked earth that would turn out to be the only cover available. The grass was brown and dry, chest-high in places. The Chu Pong Massif rose to the southwest, its slopes dark with jungle. It was hot. Beck remembered the extreme heat and exhaustion taking hold, the way a man's uniform soaked through before he'd walked 100 yards. For the first 20 minutes or so, nothing happened. The men spread out. Some of them, like Beck, ate. Others checked their weapons, filled canteens from the creek, took their bearings. Joe Galloway, a UPI correspondent who'd come in with the battalion and would later be awarded the Bronze Star for picking up a rifle, and helping evacuate wounded, described the initial calm. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was the kind of silence that men who've been in combat recognize. The absence of something that should be there. No birds, no insects. The jungle was watching. Then Bravo Company's 1st Platoon, under Lieutenant Henry Herrick, pushed out toward the mountain and ran into a force of NVA soldiers. What started as a patrol contact became, within minutes, the opening of a full-scale engagement. Herrick's platoon was cut off almost immediately, surrounded by elements of the 33rd NVA Regiment, unable to withdraw, taking casualties from 3 sides. Herrick himself was killed early in the fighting. The platoon was isolated for the better part of 24 hours before other units could reach them. Back at the landing zone, the rest of the battalion was now in contact along the entire perimeter. NVA soldiers came out of the tree line in numbers that the Americans hadn't anticipated. Moore later said that his unit was outnumbered roughly 6-1, about 2,400 NVA against 400 Americans on the ground at the peak of the fighting. The enemy wasn't probing. They were massing for human wave assaults, running through the grass in groups of 20 and 30, firing AK-47s, throwing grenades, trying to overrun the positions before the Americans could call in air support and artillery. And this is where the age matters. Because the men absorbing that assault, the men in the grass, behind the termite mounds, feeding belts into machine guns that were overheating in the midday sun, most of them were between 19 and 23 years old. George McDonald, a mortarman in Charlie Company, jumped off his Huey into a landing zone that was already under fire. He was carrying an M79 grenade launcher, a stubby, short-range weapon that didn't have the reach to hit the tree line. He saw soldiers lying in the grass firing their rifles, muzzle flashes winking from the jungle, and he had to figure out, in the space of a few seconds, where to go and what to do with a weapon that couldn't touch the enemy at that distance. Beck's situation was more specific, and in some ways worse. His machine gun crew was a 3-man team: Russell Adams on the M60, Beck as assistant gunner, and an ammo bearer. When the firing started, the ammo bearer disappeared. Beck never found out exactly what happened to him. So Beck followed Adams as they ran forward, away from the platoon toward the Chu Pong Massif, trying to set up a position about 75 yards ahead of their own line. They were in the open, in brown grass, with no cover but the grass itself, laying down fire into the tree line while NVA soldiers maneuvered toward them. Beck's own words about that moment: "I can remember the extreme heat and exhaustion taking hold now, like I hadn't taken a breath the entire time. We were soaked with sweat, and the sun was very hot as we lay in the brown grass, in the open with really no cover but the grass." Adams was hit. Beck took over the machine gun. He kept firing. In the first 30 seconds of the engagement, Beck said he'd seen 5 men shot, 3 of them killed, including the radio operator right beside him. And here's the thing that I think matters most about what a young soldier actually understood in those minutes. Beck didn't describe fear. He described confusion. He didn't know where the fire was coming from. He didn't know how many enemy were in front of him. He couldn't see them in the grass and the trees. He could see the effects: men falling, bullets kicking up dirt, the sound of AK-47s, which has a distinctive crack that's different from an M16. But the enemy itself was invisible. He was fighting shapes, sounds, and muzzle flashes. That confusion, not cowardice, not panic, just the honest inability of a man who'd never been shot at before to process what was happening around him fast enough to react correctly, is what the young soldiers at Ia Drang had to overcome in real time. They didn't have the luxury of learning from one firefight and applying those lessons to the next. The first firefight was the big one. It was the full thing, all at once, with no ramp-up. And the way they learned was by watching. The young draftees watched the sergeants. They watched the few veterans who'd been in Korea or had combat time elsewhere. They watched men like Sergeant Basil Plumley, the battalion sergeant major, a World War II and Korea veteran who walked the perimeter during the battle as calmly as a man checking fence posts, and whose presence alone kept men in their positions when every instinct told them to run. A 19-year-old kid who's never heard a shot fired in anger will stay in his foxhole if the 40-year-old sergeant major is standing upright 10 feet away, not because of discipline, but because the older man's behavior rewrites what the younger man thinks is possible. That's how it actually worked. Not through training manuals, through example, transmitted in the middle of the thing itself. Nadal, who commanded Alpha Company, said later that his duty was to move to the sound of the guns. He was a West Point graduate, older than most of his men, experienced. But even he described the weight of what he found at X-ray, the speed of the NVA assault, the closeness of the enemy, the fact that his soldiers were in a fight for their lives within minutes of landing in a place they'd never seen before. Nadal's company and Charlie Company discovered a 40-yard gap between their positions that the NVA exploited, pouring soldiers through it toward the interior of the perimeter. Plugging that gap with fire and bodies was the work of men who, an hour earlier, had been eating sea rations in the grass. The battle at X-ray lasted 3 days, November 14th through the 16th. The Americans held. Artillery from LZ Falcon, 6 miles east, fired over 18,000 rounds in support. Air Force fighters dropped napalm and high explosive, sometimes within 200 meters of American positions. Bruce Crandall and Ed Freeman, helicopter pilots with the 229th Assault Helicopter Battalion, flew repeated resupply and medevac missions into the landing zone after it had been closed to regular traffic because of the intensity of the fire. Both men eventually received the Medal of Honor for those flights. Freeman in 2001, Crandall in 2007. 40 years after the battle. 79 Americans were killed at LZ X-ray. 121 were wounded. The NVA losses were estimated at over 600 killed, though the exact number, like most body counts in Vietnam, is uncertain. 2 days later, at LZ Albany, 2 miles away, the 2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry, walked into an ambush while marching in column through the jungle and lost 155 men killed in a single afternoon. The combined toll of the Ia Drang campaign was 234 Americans dead and 250 wounded. Moore wrote about it afterward with Galloway. The book was called We Were Soldiers Once, and Young. That title came from a poem, but it also described a fact. They were young. Moore's battalion had a median age that put most of his riflemen and machine gunners between 19 and 22. These were men who, 18 months before the battle, had been in high school, or working jobs, or starting college. Beck had been painting. Adams had been 2 weeks from going home when X-ray happened. 2 weeks. Lieutenant Joe Marm, a platoon leader in Alpha Company, was 24, old by the standards of that fight, and he single-handedly charged an NVA machine gun position, destroying it with grenades and rifle fire before being severely wounded. He received the Medal of Honor. But the men behind him, the ones who followed him forward and kept the position after he went down, were the draftees, the teenagers, the men nobody would write citations for. After the battle, Beck stayed in the Army, finished his tour, went home to Pennsylvania, and became an artist. He spent decades drawing the faces and scenes from Ia Drang, the men he'd fought beside, the grass, the termite mounds, the mountain in the background. Moore asked him to create sketches for the book. Beck agreed. He drew from memory, and the memories, he said, never faded. Every detail, the color of the grass, the angle of the light, the way a man's body looked when he fell, was still there, stored in a place that 50 years couldn't reach. Beck died on March 19, 2025, at 81. Moore had died in 2017. Adams, the gunner Beck had taken over for, survived his wounds. The two of them spent years telling the story together, and in 1996, 31 years after the battle, they were finally awarded the Bronze Star with Valor for what they'd done on that hillside in the grass. I keep going back to the C rations. The can Beck opened when he stepped off the helicopter. He was hungry, so he ate. A few minutes later, men were dying around him, and he was feeding a belt into a machine gun he hadn't expected to be firing. That's the distance between training and combat. It's not measured in months or miles. It's measured in the time it takes to put down a can and pick up a gun. And from that moment on, nothing you thought you understood about yourself is reliable anymore. Beck was asked once, years later, what he learned at Ia Drang. He didn't say anything about courage or duty. He said, "In the first 30 seconds, I saw 5 guys shot." That's what he learned. That's what he kept.